At one point, you're probably going to need a login screen for your application, and in this screencast, we're going to look at one way to achieve just that. We're going to create the login screen and use the validation framework in TornadoFX. We're also going to provide some feedback based on how the login goes. Instead of creating our own server sides, we're going to use the GitHub API to do the authentication. They have an API where you can supply basic authentication, and then you can access their services. And we're going to access the user resource and retrieve some properties from that JSON blob and put it into our user model. After a successful logging, we're going to change the login screen into the main screen of the application. And in there, we are also going to access that user model that we created during the login process. Lastly, we're going to log out again and redisplay the login screen. First, a little about the API. So if you hit api.github.com/user and authenticate with basic authentication, you're going to get a JSON blob that looks something like this. It's going to have a lot of extra fields in there. I removed most of them just to show you that the one we're interested in. So we want to extract the name property and put it into our user model. So let's get started with some programming. The login screen will be the first screen that the user sees. It will consist of a form. So inside this form, let's create a field set. And we're going to set the label positioning to vertical. That means that the labels will appear right above the input fields. Our first field will be a username field. And it's going to contain a text field. And we're going to bind this text field to something. Let's just leave it for now and define a password field. This will be a password field instead. And we need a button. It's going to say login. And we can start to define the action already. But first, let's set some properties. So let's start with looking at how to bind data to these text fields and how to use it after we hit login. Let's define an inline view model. Let's call it model. It's a view model. This model is only going to be used internally in the login screen, so we're not going to define an object. It's never going to be reused anyway. But we need some properties that we can bind to and that can help us to perform validation. So let's define a username field and say that we want to bind that to a simple string property. Now we've connected this username field to the model so that when we perform validation, for example, in the model, this username field will be part of that process. Let's do the same for a password field. It's quite alike. It's the same thing, actually. And we're going to need access to the LoginController, but let's leave that for now and start wiring up these text fields. So the username field will be bound to the username property, and we're going to set a required validator on the field. We're also going to do the same for the password field, this time bind it to the password property. Now to the button. This button will only be available when both the username and password fields are filled in. So let's say enable when the model is valid. Let's make it the default button so you can hit enter anywhere and execute the button action. So let's say isDefault is true. We also want to stretch this button so it's as wide as the input fields, and we can use the useMaxWidth property for that. Now it's time to define the action. So the action for this button we'll call run async with progress. What that will do is, of course, run whatever we put in here asynchronously off of the UI thread, but it's also going to display a progress indicator in the button while the action is running. Now it's time to access the login controller. So I've started preparing it. It's basically now just an empty class. So we can start by injecting it in here, and we can use the inject TornadoFX component function and find the LoginController. So what we're going to do is to call the LoginController, and we need a function called login in there, and we can pass it the username and password values. And from here on out, it's up to the LoginController to actually do something with that data that we pass to it. I also promised that we would give some kind of feedback to the user so that he knows if the login failed and for what reason. So let's define a label, and we can define this label actually outside of the field set if we want. So let's see, this label we also want to bind to something in the LoginController, because the LoginController will be in charge of setting some text property that we can use to display to the user. So let's call that status property, and we're going to need to define that. So let's head over to the LoginController and define status property. Let's say that it's a simple string property. That's good enough here, and we will add accessors to it as well. Let's head back. Now we bound this label to the status property, and we don't have a style sheet here, so I'm just gonna add some inline styling to this. This feedback label will only be used to display errors, so we can set the text field to color red, for example. We're also going to add just a little padding so it's not right under the button. Give it some breathing room, and let's make it bold. Now we can go on to define the login function itself in the LoginController. Actually, let's use the ID to help us create it. So the first parameter is going to be the username. It's going to be a string. Then we have the password, which is also going to be a string. And we don't need to return anything. So we're going to use the REST interface for this. So let's define a property that will inject, that we're going to inject the REST API into. So let's call it API and say that it's the REST interface, and we're going to get it using injection. Now in the init block of the LoginController, we can set the base URI to our GitHub address, and that is https API github.com and a slash. So whenever we access the REST API, we're now going to have this base URL already set up for us. So in the login function, let's start by setting this status property to an empty string. Actually, let's also start it with an empty string, but whenever you retry the login function, we would like to update this status property and set it to an empty string. Now this function login we will call off of the UI thread, so let's use the run later function to set status to empty string again. Now we can configure the basic auth based on the username and password passed in. And those are not nullable, so that looks better. Now we can retrieve a response, and normally let's set up the response. We're going to call the user endpoint. Normally APIs tend to return JSON if it's successful, and then it might return HTML if login fails. At GitHub, they always return JSON actually, so we can always say that the response, let's see, response, we want to extract response like this. We want to extract JSON from it no matter what. Of course, we are going to check the result status, but we're going to use the something from the JSON response anyway. So let's just do that once and for all. Calling one creates this JSON object for us. And it also makes sure that we have consumed the JSON response. So now it's closed, and we can still inspect it, but we don't need to do any more housekeeping on it. So the rest of the code is going to happen on the UI thread. And let's start by checking if the response was successful. So if we actually logged in, we're going to do something. And what we're going to do is take that JSON blob, turn it into a user object, and set this into a user model. So before we can do more here, we need to define the user. So I set up a user class, and in here we're going to have a name property. I'm using the inspection available to me to turn a normal property into a JavaFX property. So now I have a name property. And this user is also going to be a JSON model object, and we're going to override the update model function, which allows us to extract data from the JSON object and put it into our properties. So with the JSON object, we will assign to name by accessing the string called name. So I'm not going to extract any more data. That's all we're going to need to get our point across. But we are going to need a view model. So let's create one based on this user. Starting from just 2 days ago, the create view model function will now use the new binding syntax. So if you've never seen this before, this is a nicer way of defining bindings inside your view models. That's actually the whole user model. So let's close that and go back to our LoginController. So we have a valid response. We know that the basic authentication was all good. We got a correct username and password, and now we can let's inject a user in here. So we'll call it user. It's going to be a user model by inject. Now we can assign data to this user. This user you can now access in the rest of your application as well. So let's say that the user item is a new item. We're going to get it by calling toModel on the JSON object. And we don't need to supply any types here because the user model is already containing objects of type user. The compiler knows this. So when we call toModel, it knows to use the correct type user. So we don't need to add it. So now we have defined the user. We made it available by injection to the rest of the application. Now we want to do something with the login screen. We want to remove it and replace it with a welcome screen. So we need a welcome screen, of course, and I just set up an empty view with a VBox in it. And what we're going to do is to find the login screen. And once we found it, we're going to replace that. Let's see, we need 2 columns here. Replace with, and we need to replace it with this welcome screen. So to make things a bit interesting, we're going to make sure that the welcome screen is not the same size as the login screen. So we need to account for that. And we do that by calling size to scene and also center on screen to be sure that everything looks good after a successful login. So if the validation fails, we also need to handle that somehow. And we will use the status property to give feedback to the user. So we can say that the status is, we can extract a string called message from this JSON object. And just in case there is no message in the JSON payload, let's just say login failed instead. So we're pretty sure now that the user is going to get some kind of meaningful error message if login fails. Later on, we're going to define the logout function, but let's leave the login function for now. And let's look at this welcome screen. So I defined a VBox, and in here I would like to show the user that is logged in, and later we're going to add a logout button. So let's start by injecting again, let's see, the user model in here, and we might want to just call it user. Let's add a label for the user and bind it to the name property. Let's go back to our login screen, and it looks like everything is set up, so we can try our first login now actually. So the login application just defines the login screen as its primary view, and we can run it. So let's try this. Let's say, for example, something that is not correct. Try to log in, and we get bad credentials. This text we didn't write, but it came from the JSON payload of the GitHub API. Now this time, let's try with something that will actually authenticate. Now we're logged in, and we can see that we retrieved the user name. So, so far so good. There was one thing that didn't go as I expected actually, and that was in the login screen. You see I set here use max height. Oh, I was supposed to do use max width. Let's just rerun to make sure that it's working the way we want. Yeah, this is the look I was going for. So let's work a little on the welcome screen now. And as promised, we need a way to log out again, and we might as well make this bigger so that we can see that the welcome screen is well, that we account for the difference in size of the welcome screen. So we do that by setting a preferred size. We can set it to 800 by 600, for example. We can set the alignment to center. Let's see. And we can also make this label just a little bigger maybe. So let's set the font weight to bold and the font size to 24 pixels, for example. And below this label, we're now going to add our button to make it possible to log out again. Let's call it logout. And the action for this button is going to be a function in the LoginController, because that's where we're going to define log out as well. So let's first do that. LoginController, add a function called logout. Let's go back and call this. So we need to inject the LoginController here as well. And now we can reference the LoginController logout function. So what we need to do when we log out is to clear the user item we put in the user model. So when we logged in, we did this. We put a user into the item property of the user model, and now we need to clear it. So user item is null. We also want to find whatever screen is showing right now in the primary screen and replace it with the login screen. And we can't just simply do the reverse of this, finding the welcome screen and replacing it with the login screen, because maybe you transitioned from the welcome screen to another screen while the user was using the application. So what we can do instead is to access the primary stage, find the scene, find the root of that scene, which is a node, and then access the UI component represented by that node. There is, however, a slightly easier way of finding that UI component. So we can now say primary stage UI component. I unfortunately have to give it a type, so we'll just give it UI component. We don't know what kind of component it is. So if the primary stage is showing a UI component, we can now do replace with. We can find the login screen again. And let's also call these two to make sure that the stage is now resized to whatever the size the login screen needs. When we do that, the login screen would be in the state that we left it in. So that means that when the user first logged in, there was some information in the username and password fields. And we would like to make sure that whenever you log out and you see the login screen again, those values needs to be cleared. So let's override on doc, which is a good place to do this, because when this callback will be called before the login screen is shown again. So let's just clear out the username value and do the same for the password value. We might as well also clear any decorators. And the reason for this is that the decorators might be called when we set the values to null. So I will try to explain what that does. If we run the application now, and I start to enter something in this field, and then I clear it, I will get this validator. And that's what's going to happen when I run this code. So to make sure that the user isn't greeted with this error message or validation error message when he wants to re-log in, we call model clear decorators. This is a new call which was just introduced and will be in TornadoFX 1.7.8. And if you're running an older version, you can also access the validation context inside of the view model and call validate with focus first error false and decorate errors false. So let's go back to the login screen. So this is what we want to do to make sure that everything looks nice when the user logs out again. So let's rerun. First, let's answer something that's wrong. It looks as expected. And in this case, we want this validation error. So when I log in now, I get my welcome screen, which has access to the logged in user. And whenever I hit log out now, I go back to the login screen, it resizes and the data is cleared and the validators are removed. So I believe this is a good place to start for login functionality in your application. There are many other ways to deal with this. You could, for example, use events if you like, or you could use scopes even and have one scope for the login screen and one scope for the rest of your application. But this is a solid place to start. Thank you for watching.